Portland, Oregon. Present day. The Wagner family lived the kind of life that appeared in home improvement magazines. Thomas Wagner, a 34-year-old software engineer, spent his weekdays debugging code and his weekends coaching Hans's soccer team. His wife Sarah, an art teacher at the local elementary school, filled their home with paintings and plants. Their son Hans was 5 years old, a bright-eyed boy who loved dinosaurs, collected toy cars, and could spend hours watching cartoons about talking animals. There was nothing unusual about him. No behavioral problems, no mysterious talents, no unexplained fears. He was perfectly, wonderfully ordinary. The Wagners had no connection to London. They had never visited England. Thomas's ancestry was German and Irish. Sarah's family came from Mexico. British history was something they learned in high school and promptly forgot. The Great Fire of London might as well have happened on another planet. But on a quiet Saturday in March, everything changed. The family visited the Oregon Historical Society for a traveling exhibit called Fires That Changed the World. It was supposed to be educational, harmless, something to do on a rainy afternoon. Hans walked through the exhibits, pointing at pictures of the Chicago fire, asking questions about firefighters. Then he turned a corner and stopped dead. A massive painting dominated the wall. London, 1666. The city consumed by flames, the Thames River reflecting orange hellfire, tiny figures fleeing across London Bridge. The painting was titled The Great Fire of London, September 6th, 1666. Hans stood motionless. His small body began trembling. Sarah noticed first. "Sweetie, what's wrong?" The boy's lips moved, forming words without sound. Then, in a whisper that barely reached his mother's ears, he said, "I died there. I couldn't breathe. The smoke took me." What would you do if your child woke up screaming about burning alive in 1666? What if he described flames consuming streets that no longer exist, spoke names from centuries past, and begged you to save him from a fire that ended 357 years ago? Before we continue, please consider subscribing to the channel and letting us know where you're watching from. We read every single comment and truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to the story. Sarah's hand gripped Hans's shoulder. "What did you say, baby?" But Hans didn't answer. His eyes remained locked on the painting, tears streaming down his cheeks. Thomas walked over, concerned. "Hey, buddy, it's just a picture. It's not real." The boy finally looked at his father, and Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Hans's expression was wrong. Too old, too knowing. "It was real, Dad. The baker's oven. Pudding Lane. It started at night when everyone was sleeping." Thomas and Sarah exchanged confused glances. Pudding Lane? Their 5-year-old had never mentioned that name before. They guided Hans away from the painting, his small legs, moving mechanically, his gaze still fixed on the flames until the exhibit wall blocked his view. The drive home was silent except for Hans's occasional whispers. So hot, so much smoke. That night the screaming started. At 2:47 a.m., a sound tore through the Wagner household that Sarah would never forget. Not a child's nightmare cry, but a scream of absolute terror and agony. She and Thomas ran to Hans's room. The boy was sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open but unseeing, his small hands clawing at his throat. "I can't breathe! The timber! It's falling! Run to the river! Run to the Thames!" Thomas grabbed his son. "Hans, wake up! You're dreaming!" But Hans kept screaming, kept gasping, his body convulsing as if flames were consuming him. "Pudding Lane! The bakery! It's spreading! God help us! It's spreading to the houses!" Sarah felt tears on her own face. "Hans, please, baby, wake up!" Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, Hans's eyes focused. He looked at his parents, confused and exhausted. "Mom, why are you crying?" He had no memory of the screaming, no awareness of what he'd said. Thomas carried him to the kitchen for water. Sarah changed his sweat-soaked sheets. Neither of them slept the rest of the night. The nightmares continued. Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night. Each time, the same terror. Each time, Hans screamed about fire, about streets with strange names, about running from flames. But the truly disturbing part began happening during the day. On Monday morning, Hans refused to sit near the fireplace. The family's gas fireplace had never bothered him before. He'd sat in front of it countless times during winter, watching cartoons. Now he wouldn't go within 10 feet of it. "It's not safe, Mum. Fire spreads. You think it's contained, but it jumps. It crosses streets. It eats everything." Sarah stared at her son. Those weren't a 5-year-old's words. That afternoon, while Sarah was grading papers, Hans asked for crayons and paper. She gave them to him absently, focused on her work. 20 minutes later, she looked up to find him drawing what appeared to be a map. Not a child's simple map with a house and trees, but an intricate street layout with dozens of tiny buildings. "What are you drawing, sweetie?" Hans didn't look up. "London, before." Sarah moved closer. The map showed a river, a bridge, densely packed streets. Hans had labelled some of them in his kindergarten handwriting. Pudding Lan, Fischstret Hill, Breadstret. Sarah felt her hands go cold. Where had he learned these names? That evening, Thomas came home from work to find Sarah on her laptop, her face pale. "What's wrong?" She turned the screen toward him. It showed a historical map of 17th century London. Next to it she'd placed Hans's drawing. The layouts matched. Streets that no longer existed, rendered in crayon by a 5-year-old who'd never studied London, never seen these maps, never had any reason to know them. "Thomas, look at this. Look at what he drew." Thomas studied both images. His rational mind searched for explanations. He must have seen it somewhere. The museum. Maybe they had maps. I checked. The exhibit didn't have any maps, just paintings and photographs. Thomas refused to believe it. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe Hans had seen a documentary. Maybe he'd overheard tour guides at the museum. Maybe. But the details kept coming. On Wednesday during dinner, Hans suddenly spoke. "The fire started on September 2nd, at 1 o'clock in the morning, in Thomas Farriner's bakery." Sarah's fork clattered against her plate. "Hans, how do you know that name?" The boy looked at her as if the answer were obvious. "Because everyone knew Thomas Farriner. He was the king's baker. He made biscuits for the Navy." Thomas felt his skepticism waver. King's baker. Navy biscuits. Where would a kindergartner learn these specifics? That night, after Hans went to bed, Sarah showed Thomas what she'd researched. Every detail Hans had mentioned was historically accurate. Thomas Farriner was indeed the king's baker. The fire did start at his bakery at approximately 1 a.m. on September 2nd, 1666. Pudding Lane, Fish Street Hill, all the streets Hans had named were real locations in 17th century London. "It's a coincidence," Thomas insisted. "Or he has an incredible memory for something he heard once." "Thomas, he's 5. He can barely remember to brush his teeth." The arguments escalated. Thomas forbid Sarah from researching further, from encouraging what he called this fantasy. Sarah accused him of ignoring their son's clear distress. But the details kept emerging regardless of their arguments. Hans described St. Paul's Cathedral, but not the current domed structure. He spoke of a Gothic building with a massive spire. When Sarah looked it up, she discovered he was describing old St. Paul's, destroyed in the fire, replaced decades later with the cathedral that stands today. He talked about people fleeing to the Thames, about London Bridge clogged with carts and families, about the fire creating its own wind. He described the smell of molten lead dripping from church roofs, of stone exploding from heat, of the ground itself burning. "How do you know all this?" Sarah asked him gently one afternoon. Hans was colouring, seemingly normal, a typical kindergartner. He looked up at her with those two old eyes. "I was there, Mum. I remember running. The smoke was black and thick. You couldn't see the sun. People were screaming, pushing, trying to get to the river. Some people jumped in the Thames with all their clothes on." He returned to his colouring, as if he'd just described a trip to the grocery store. Sarah recorded everything in a notebook. September 2nd to 6th, 1666. 4 days of burning. 87 churches destroyed. 13,000 houses gone. The Royal Exchange, the Guildhall, vast sections of the medieval city reduced to ash. The fire created. Firestorms. Temperatures so intense that pottery melted, glass fused, stone crumbled. Hans knew it all. Thomas came home one evening to find Sarah crying in their bedroom. "We need help. This isn't normal. Our son knows things he shouldn't know." "Sarah, stop. You're making this worse. Kids are impressionable. The more attention we give this, the more he'll continue. He wakes up screaming about burning alive. It's night terrors. It'll pass." But it didn't pass. Hans started refusing to leave the house on windy days. "Wind spreads fire, Dad. The wind blew from the east. That's why the fire moved so fast. The Lord Mayor didn't order fire breaks soon enough. Mayor Bloodworth said it was just a woman's fire, small enough to piss on. But he was wrong. So wrong." Thomas stood frozen. Lord Mayor. Bloodworth. Fire breaks. His 5-year-old son was discussing 17th century firefighting strategies and municipal failures. That night, against Thomas's explicit wishes, Sarah did something desperate. She contacted Dr. Elizabeth Harrow, a British historian at Oxford who specialised in the Great Fire of London. Sarah found her university email and wrote a carefully worded message explaining the situation, attaching photos of Hans's drawings and notes of his statements. She didn't expect a response. She got one within 6 hours. Dr. Harrow's email was brief and urgent. "Mrs. Wagner, I need to speak with your son immediately. What you've described is impossible, but I need to verify it myself. Are you available for a video call tomorrow?" The next evening, Thomas reluctantly agreed to participate. Dr. Harrow appeared on screen, a woman in her 60s with grey hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. "Hello, Hans. I'm Dr. Harrow. I study the Great Fire of London. Your mum says you know some things about it." Hans nodded solemnly. For the next hour, Dr. Harrow asked questions. Hans answered each one with unsettling precision. He described the failed fire breaks, the use of gunpowder to create gaps in the building rows, Mayor Bloodworth's catastrophic delays. He named destroyed landmarks, the Royal Exchange, Baynard's Castle, Bridewell Palace. Dr. Harrow's expression shifted from sceptical to stunned. Then she asked a question that made Sarah's breath catch. "Hans, were there any places people tried to hide from the fire?" Hans nodded immediately. On Bread Street there was a merchant's house with a cellar, a stone cellar, very deep. Families ran there thinking the stone would protect them. There were arches, 3 arches, and a well in the corner. But the heat came down through the floors. The timber beams fell through. Dr. Harrow's face went white. Her hands began shaking. What did you say about the arches?" 3 arches. Stonework. Old stonework from before, maybe from when the Romans were there. The well was dry. That's why people thought they'd be safe." Dr. Harrow stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Thomas and Sarah watched her walk, off-screen. They could hear her breathing heavily. When she returned, there were tears on her face. "That cellar was only discovered 8 months ago during construction work on Bread Street. The architectural details haven't been published yet. Only our research team knows about the 3 Roman arches and the dry well. There is no way, no possible way, a child in America could know that." She looked directly at the camera. I'm booking a flight to Portland. I need to meet him in person. Dr. Harrow arrived 3 days later, her academic composure barely concealing her urgency. She spent 2 full days interviewing Hans, recording everything, asking increasingly specific questions. On the second day, she asked him, "Hans, in your memories, who were you?" The boy had been playing with toy cars. He stopped, his small hands going still. "I worked for Master Edmund. He had a printer's shop near St. Paul's. I was his apprentice." "What was your name?" "William Taswell." Sarah gasped. Dr. Harrow's eyes widened. "Hans, William Taswell was a real person. He survived the fire. He wrote about it." Hans shook his head, frustrated. "No, that's wrong. I wasn't that William. I was Thomas Middleton. I was the apprentice printer, not the witness. William Taswell watched from far away. I was inside it." Dr. Harrow wrote frantically. "Thomas Middleton. And you worked where?" "On Watling Street. The shop was on Watling Street near the cathedral. Master Edmund had proof plates, metal plates for printing important documents. When the fire came, I buried them in the courtyard. I wrapped them in leather and buried them so they wouldn't melt." "Why didn't you leave?" Hans's voice became very quiet, very sad. "I did leave. I ran to the river with everyone else. But then I remembered the plates. Master Edmund had spent everything on them. Without them, he'd be ruined. So I went back." Tears formed in Hans's eyes. "The building was already burning. I got to the courtyard, but when I tried to leave, the front wall collapsed. The stones fell on me. I couldn't move. The smoke. I couldn't breathe. It was so hot. And then everything went dark." He looked at Dr. Harrow with eyes far too ancient for his face. "I was 19 years old. I never got married. I never had children. I died trying to save metal plates that didn't matter." Dr. Harrow spent that night cross-referencing parish records, property registries, anything from 1666, London. At 3 a.m., Dr. Harrow knocked on the Wagners' bedroom door. Thomas answered, groggy and annoyed, but Dr. Harrow's expression silenced his complaint. "I found him. Thomas Middleton, apprentice to Edmund Wright. Printer. Property on Watling Street. Listed in the guild records from 1664. After the fire, he's marked as unaccounted for in the parish register. Presumed dead? No body recovered?" Sarah sat up in bed. "So he's real?" "He's real. And if what Hans says is true, if he buried printing plates in that courtyard, before the building collapsed on him, then we can prove this. We can actually prove this." Thomas finally spoke. "Prove what? That our son is, what, reincarnated?" Dr. Harrow looked at him directly. "I don't know what your son is, Mr. Wagner, but I know that he possesses information that should be impossible, and I know that if those plates are where he says they are, buried under 3.5 centuries of London construction, then something has happened here that science cannot explain." She turned to Sarah. "We need to go to London, all of us." The trip was arranged within a week. Dr. Harrow made calls to the Museum of London, to property owners, to archaeological contacts. She explained nothing except that she had a potential lead on an undiscovered 17th century site. As the departure date approached, Hans became increasingly agitated. He had nightmares every night now, but they were different, less terrified, more urgent. "I need to go back, Mom. I need to show them. Thomas Middleton needs to be found. He's been waiting so long." On the flight to London, Hans pressed his face against the window, watching the ocean pass below. "I'm going home," he whispered. "After all this time, I'm finally going home." Sarah held his hand, not knowing whether to be hopeful or terrified. Thomas sat rigid, his entire world-view crumbling, unable to process what was happening. Dr. Harrow reviewed her notes, preparing for what she suspected would be the most significant discovery of her career, or the most embarrassing failure. They landed at Heathrow on a grey morning. Hans stepped onto British soil and immediately looked disoriented. "Everything is different," The buildings are so tall. Where are the timber houses? Where are the church spires? Dr. Harrow drove them into London. As they approached the city centre, Hans became increasingly distressed. This isn't right. This isn't how it looked. The streets are too wide. Where's the city wall? Where's Newgate? They reached the monument, the tall column built to commemorate the fire. Hans stared at it, then began walking, ignoring the modern traffic, the cars, the buses. He walked as if following a memory, turning down streets that his body recognized even though his eyes saw nothing familiar. Here was Fish Street Hill. The fire climbed the hill like it was alive, eating every building. And there, that's where Pudding Lane was. The bakery was right there. He pointed to a modern office building. Dr. Harrow checked her historical maps. He was exactly correct. Hans led them through the financial district, past banks and coffee shops, narrating a London that no longer existed. St. Margaret's Church was here. The fire took the roof, but the walls stood for a day before collapsing. And there, that corner, that's where the Printers' Guild Hall was. Master Edmund took me there once to register my apprenticeship. Finally, he stopped on Watling Street. Modern cars rushed past. A glass-fronted building rose above them. Hans walked to a specific spot on the sidewalk, then stepped into the building's small courtyard. Here, right here. This is where the shop was. That direction was the front, facing the street. The printing press was against that wall. And the courtyard was... He walked to a spot near the building's foundation. Here, I buried them here. 3 feet down, wrapped in leather, under the old foundation stones. They're still here. I can feel it. Dr. Harrow had already arranged access. The building owner, skeptical but curious, had agreed to a ground-penetrating radar survey. The radar equipment arrived that afternoon. Technicians set it up while Hans sat on a bench, exhausted, as if the weight of 2 lifetimes pressed down on him. The technicians moved the equipment over the courtyard, their screens showing layers of earth, modern foundations, older structures beneath. When they reached the spot Hans had indicated, they stopped. There's something here. Metal signature about 1 meter down, and there's a void beneath it like a collapsed space. Dr. Harrow's heart raced. Can we excavate? Within 2 days, permits were arranged. An emergency archaeological dig was authorized. Workers carefully removed modern paving stones, then began the methodical process of excavating through layers of history. At 2 feet, they found Victorian-era materials. At 3 feet, they reached older foundations, 17th century stonework. Hans stood at the edge of the dig, his small face intense. Keep going. Beneath the foundation stones, I put them deeper than the building's foundation because I didn't want anyone to find them by accident. The archaeologists looked at Dr. Harrow. She nodded. They carefully removed stones. And there, exactly where a 5-year-old boy had said they would be, wrapped in disintegrated leather that crumbled at touch, were 6 metal printing plates. The lead archaeologist lifted one carefully. The plate showed text, backwards as printing plates should be, with dates and ornate lettering from the 1660s. My God, she whispered, these are real. These are actual 17th century proof plates. But they weren't finished. As they excavated further, documenting the plate's exact position, they found something else. Bones, human bones, a partial skeleton crushed beneath what had once been a wall. The forensic archaeologist examined the remains carefully. Male, approximately 18 to 22 years old. Massive traumatic injuries consistent with being crushed by falling masonry. The position suggests he was trying to crawl, probably overcome by smoke before the structure collapsed on him. Dr. Harrow looked at Hans. The boy's eyes were closed, tears streaming down his face. That's me. That's Thomas Middleton. I've been there all this time, waiting under the stones. The printing plates were taken to the Museum of London for analysis. Carbon dating confirmed they were from the 1660s. The metal composition matched techniques used in that era. Most remarkably, researchers found property records showing that Edmund Wright, printer, had owned a shop on Watling Street. The shop was listed as completely destroyed in the fire. Edmund Wright survived but died in poverty in 1668, his business ruined. There was a notation in the guild records about an apprentice named Thomas Middleton, but no further information. Until now. The remains were prepared for burial. Dr. Harrow arranged for them to be interred in the churchyard of St. Mary Le Bow, one of the few churches rebuilt after the fire. On a quiet morning, the Wagner family attended the ceremony. A small plaque was placed. Thomas Middleton, apprentice printer, 1647 to 1666, finally at rest. Hans stood before the grave, holding a single white flower. He placed it on the freshly turned earth. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for letting me rest." That night, something changed. Hans slept peacefully for the first time in months. No screaming, no nightmares, no terror. Over the following days, his memories began to fade like morning fog. He stopped speaking in archaic phrases. He asked to visit the London Zoo instead of historical sites. He wanted fish and chips, complained about being tired, acted like the 5-year-old he was. Dr. Harrow noticed it first. He's letting go. Whatever connection brought those memories forward, it's releasing him now. By the time they boarded the flight back to Portland, Hans had only vague recollections. "We did something important in London, right, Mom?" Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes, baby, something very important." "I don't really remember, but I feel lighter, like I was carrying something heavy and now it's gone." A week after returning home, Hans had no conscious memory of Thomas Middleton, no knowledge of the Great Fire, no recollection of the printing plates or the skeleton beneath Watling Street. He was simply Hans Wagner, 5 years old, who loved dinosaurs and cartoons. 6 months passed. Hans started kindergarten, made friends, learned to ride a bike without training wheels. He showed no unusual knowledge, no impossible memories. He was perfectly, wonderfully ordinary again. But the evidence remained. The printing plates were displayed in the Museum of London's permanent collection. The exhibit card read, 17th century printing plates, discovered 2024, Watling Street excavation. Believed to belong to Edmund Wright, printer. Buried during the Great Fire of London, September 1666. No mention of how they were discovered. No mention of a 5-year-old boy from Oregon. Dr. Harrow published a carefully worded paper in the Journal of Archaeological Discovery. She described the find, the forensic evidence, the historical validation. In a footnote, she mentioned local assistance in identifying the excavation site, but provided no details. The plaque at St. Mary Le Bow remained. Tourists occasionally photographed it, unaware of the extraordinary story behind those simple words. Thomas Wagner returned to his software engineering, but something fundamental had changed in him. The man who believed only in logic and code now attended church with Sarah, seeking answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. Sarah kept her notebook, filled with Hans's statements, carefully locked away. Someday, when Hans was older, she would show it to him. Let him decide what it meant. The mystery lingered. Was it truly reincarnation? Had Hans's soul lived before as Thomas Middleton? Or was it something else, some inexplicable connection across time, some quantum entanglement of consciousness that science couldn't yet explain? The questions remained unanswered, but the facts were undeniable. A 5-year-old boy led archaeologists to a discovery that had waited 357 years. He knew details no child should know. He described his own death with accuracy that forensic evidence confirmed. And when his task was complete, when Thomas Middleton's remains were finally laid to rest with dignity, the memories faded, freeing Hans to be a child again. Press 1 if you believe Hans truly remembered his past life. Press 2 if you think there's another explanation. Comment below with your own unexplained experiences. Have you or someone you know ever remembered things that seem impossible? Subscribe to explore more mysteries of reincarnation and the eternal journey of the soul. Like this video if this story moved you, if it made you question what you thought you knew about life, death, and the possibility that our souls continue across lifetimes. Because perhaps death is not the end. Perhaps some souls carry their stories forward, waiting centuries for someone to listen, to believe, to finally bring them home.